Hi, everyone. Welcome to another interview with myself, Oracle Oriah, and our esteemed guest, Khemetologist Stephen Mehler. And he has been coming and doing these interviews with us for weeks and weeks and weeks. He is showcasing, he is diving in to all of his work that he's done with us over the years, the last 55 years of his studies. And I mean, Stephen, honestly, you really have so many areas that you have like dived in completely. It's not just chematology. It's also crystal skulls. It's also, women's studies and how, patriarchy has affected our world. And it's, anthropology. Every topic you have made this your life's mission to share as a wisdom teacher, all this information with us, which we're so grateful, and to have this body of work. And he's an author of 3 amazing books, and we'll put that in the link in the description below. And his beautiful wife, Teresa, also, she's an author and a novelist, and she has her works. And please get to know Stephen, understand his world. He is worth knowing and worth diving into his world. Just like you had your teacher, Hakeem, and you dived into his world, and people are going to learn to dive into your world. And that's what these shows are about. This is why I'm doing this. And so today we're going to be talking about crystal skulls. And Stephen, just take it away. You're going to tell us.
Okay, we have a lot of material, so we'll obviously we'll go to a second session for sure.
Okay.
We're going to talk about another great teacher that I had today, and that'll be the theme today. First, I want to start with a little caveat, a little rejoinder from our last session, which seems like so long ago now.
I know.
Whenever we spend a week away, it seems like so long. And we've done this since August. You mentioned how long we've been doing this, since August. Last time, you got some feedback. You gave me some feedback. I got some feedback. And I want to make it seem like we're not a bunch of drug addicts advocating drug use.
Okay, so you're
even though you hate the word, because we're talking about plant helpers, plant teachers, which are natural substances, not
drugs. And for those of you who don't know what show he's talking about, there's the show prior to this one. We talked about plant medicine and
psychedelics and shamanism.
We just went kind of, because we have a lot of experience in this area, so we really just went in and talked a lot about it.
But there were some people who were purists who came in and said, well, my guru tells me we're not supposed to take anything foreign into our body, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera.
Well, then don't
we're talking about natural substances, but I want to just do a little bit on that, because about gurus and all this. I don't know if you and Riz are aware, but about 20 years ago, there was a movement, particularly in your area, the LA area, called breatharians.
I wanted to become a breatharian.
Aha. Well, let me tell you a story about this fella. Okay, it was big, it was popular, started by a man named Wiley, I believe, and he was advocating that you don't need to take anything into your body, just be pure, just exist on breath, and he was a living example of that. And he had many followers. It was a very popular movement. Like I said, you were interested. Mm-hmm. Okay, there was a weekend seminar he did in a hotel in LA, okay, where he had many, many people gathered. Now, he would tell his people, okay, I'm going to talk to you in the daytime, but don't bother me at night. At night, I do my breath work, I do my work. Nobody bother me at night. Okay. Well, there were a couple of women who, after one session with him, they had some questions. They were dying. They said, we have to get answers to these questions. He said, well, he won't mind if we come to his room. So they went up to his room, and what did they see in front of his room but a tray from McDonald's that had been a Big Mac and fries. And so here was this great guru who would sneak away at night, eat junk food, and tell everybody in the daytime not to have anything but breath. Okay. There are a lot of gurus that are purists and blah, 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 blah. What we're going to say is we're talking about the path of the shaman. Plant helpers were not the only path. So let's say to people who don't want to deal in that subject, there are other methods to become a shaman. Of course, we talked about once the shamans became self-aware, they delved in a lot of different exercises and techniques to keep consciousness high. Breathing exercises and techniques, which became the modern practice of yoga. Very ancient, and led to meditation, which was a key. Okay, I talked to you, and you have mentioned my great teacher, Abdel Hakim Awayan. I'm going to talk about another great teacher today. But Hakim, as I have mentioned, I'll mention again, was chosen by his maternal uncle, Mahmoud, Zeki Mahmoud Awayan, who sent him to a Sufi master at the age of 6 years old to learn. And he learned Sufi wisdom. And he learned to memorize the Quran. But what Hakim always said to me, the most important thing he learned from his master was how to meditate. You cannot become a shaman. You cannot become a mystic. You cannot become anything on the spiritual path unless you learn to meditate. That is key. That is essential. Have to go inward, have to find the truth inward before there's any truth outward. So meditation, very, very ancient part of the shamans. So that's key to people who don't want to do anything foreign. Then again, the other system that the shamans got into were the use of crystals. Now, we could spend the whole topic today just talking about crystals, but I'm going to rush through that point so we can get to the skulls, which is where we really want to talk about today. Okay. Crystals. What are crystals? Well, first of all, there are many great books I could recommend to people. I have a full library. I didn't want to bring out all my books. I can send you a reading list. Great, great books have been written about crystals. However, one in particular I would recommend, I don't have it, it's called The Crystal Book by a man named Dale, D-A-E-L Walker. Bless his memory, his past, but he was a devoted student of the man we're going to talk about today, the great master of crystal skulls. That's a great book. But I recommend another book highly to people who want to get into crystals. I don't know if everybody can see this. Yes, they can. Called The Crystal Blueprint by a lady named Beatrice Singer. Beatrice with a Z, S-I-N-G-E-R. Now, this book is fresh, written in 2018. That's why it's up to date, full of all the information there is about crystals people want to know. Beatrice contacted me in 2017, found out that I had been involved with crystal skulls as well as Egypt and wanted to interview me. She did. That interview and the material is included in this book. She also includes another great teacher, Greg Braden, who was also a student of my beloved Hakim. Okay. She talks about her own personal journey, how she healed herself with crystals. She's South American, from Venezuela, Colombia, now lives near you in Santa Barbara, San Bernardino area, and does crystal healing. That's why I'm recommending to people. She tells a great personal journey, how she healed herself going to India, dealing with the great shamans, mystics in India, and Tibetan Buddhists, and learned how to use crystals for healing. It's a great book. She's a great person. She was, and her husband, David, who's a pulmonologist, is one of the great frontline people in this COVID crisis, has done a great work. They both were the first two people to sign up my 2018 tour and came to Egypt with me. And we discussed about the ancient Egyptians' use of crystals, et cetera, et cetera. So if people want to know more about crystals, and she does crystal healings, like Riz does online channeling, she does online crystal healing. Beatrice Singer, S-I-N-G-E-R, she's on Facebook. You can go find her. Okay. What are crystals? Well, crystals are basic elements of what we are. Our body is full of crystals. Our blood is liquid crystal. Our bones are crystal. Now, there used to be a store in San Francisco. This decade I'm going to talk about now is the 70s and the 80s, where I did all this work. There was a crystal store in San Francisco in the 70s that was named Bones of Our Ancestors, because that's what the Native Americans called crystals, the bones of our ancestors. Now, people got into, oh, well, that's not bones. Our bones are not crystal, blah, blah, blah. Well, turns out, like we always say, there's always things about indigenous wisdom that come to be truthful. Okay. Well, when I was a kid, maybe when you were a kid, everybody's taught, you got to drink your milk. You got to drink your milk. You got to get your calcium, because your calcium is necessary for your bones. Okay, we're taught basically we need calcium and magnesium for healthy bones. But if it was just for calcium and magnesium, we would be like Plastic Man. We would have rubbery. No, we need trace quantities of silicon that gives our bones our rigidity to our skeleton. So silicon is an element that is natural to us. And what are quartz crystals? Well, as it's been described, quartz crystals are frozen water. It's a combination of water and sand that mixes together under tremendous heat and pressure and becomes quartz crystal. Quartz crystal, this is my wife's crystal, got a nice little baby right next to it. It's a beautiful piece. We have tons of crystals. It's silicon dioxide. So in other words, H2O, which is hydrogen in two bonds of water, the hydrogen atom gets replaced by the silicon atom, and then it fuses into the solid frozen water, which is quartz crystal, silicon dioxide. And
Mm.
it's a silicon atom to 2 oxygen atoms. It's going to be important when we discuss how these things work. Now, silicon is natural to our body, so it's able to be attuned easily. Well, what ancient peoples found is that crystal has a great ability to tune to the human mind, to direct energy, to release energy. We know now scientifically in the field of crystallography, if you just squeeze, put pressure on quartz crystal, it's what's called piezoelectric. It produces a minute electrical charge. Not only that, we find that quartz crystal can take an incoherent electrical charge and make it coherent.
That's incredible.
This is why we have our watches, our computers. I lived in San Jose, California, north of you, just north of me, what was called, became known in the 70s and 80s as Silicon Valley.
Right.
Computers, Apple, everything started there. Steve Jobs, all there. Because silicon chips are the basis to our computers, how we store energy, how we store memory. So ancient peoples, really, we can go back to Neanderthal, who we know used crystals, ancient peoples. As I mentioned in chematology, we can go to Tut's tomb of King Tutankhamun. He had a goblet found in his tomb that was made of pure quartz crystal. Also, a necklace was found that had the sacred stones to the Khemetans, lapis, carnelian, turquoise, and quartz beads in his crystal. So obviously ancient peoples known about crystals and have used crystals for healing. Okay, I became interested in crystals in the 70s. I started to have crystals. I said, okay, shamans have worked with these, ancient mystics work with them, but I knew very little about them. So now comes to the story that we really want to get into. Now, we're going to talk about crystals in general, but crystal skulls in specific.
Okay.
Now, I found out of some books that were written in the 70s that were discussing a particular crystal skull, which has become known as the most famous of all the crystal skulls, called the Mitchell Hedges crystal skull. Now, I'm going to reveal information, as I did in my book, which I'll talk about this, that has never been revealed publicly before. But there was books written about it, particularly this book, which came out in the early 70s by a man named Richard Garvin, called The Crystal Skull. This skull appeared in the 70s by an art restorer named Frank Dorland, took it to Hewlett-Packard Laboratories, did testing on it, and wrote and did all sorts of things about it. So this book is based on that. So the first crystal skull that seemed to be known is called the Mitchell Hedges crystal skull. I later found out there were much earlier skulls than that. So another book came out, which I have to mention, came out later in there, called Skull Speaks. A friend of the person who owned it, which was channeling, all channeling. Now we're going to talk in detail about channeling at another time. But I always say to people when it comes to channeling, even knowing that your husband is a professional, that they should take channeling with large grains of salt.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
We're going to talk more about that when we go, because if it resonates with you,
yes, you
stay
have
with
to do
it.
it that way.
If it is totally foreign to you and you have no other verification of it,
Yes.
take it with large grains of salt.
Yes.
Because as you know, as Riz knows, there are zillions of people who channel. This started big in the 70s. I met some of the great channels today. I'm going to talk about that again in more detail, particularly a woman named Sylvia Brown.
Right.
There's a name you might know.
Yes.
It became the most popular channel in Hollywood in the 70s.
Yep.
She used to charge $300 an hour to
Yes.
channel. In the 70s.
That's
not,
like $600 today.
Not 2020. Right.
Wow.
We won't talk about it. We'll go into that more detail later.
I know a little bit about her, yeah.
Well, I'd heard about a crystal skull, but I knew very little about it. So in 1977, I got involved with the Rosicrucian Order, Amark, in San Jose, California, as I mentioned when I talked about Egypt. As far as the Rosicrucian connection to Egypt. Well, here's another story.
Right.
Rosicrucians were known as being great mystics in the Middle Ages and using many tools, and crystals were part of what they used. So I got involved with the Rosicrucians, got to learn more about crystals, but in 1979, I was working for the Rosicrucian Order as a staff research scientist, access to all their files, all their documents. We were contacted, at least the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum, the curator was contacted by a businessman living in San Jose, California, Mexican-American named John Zamora. He claimed he had an artifact that he wanted us to document, to verify, And we could display it in the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum if we wanted. Of
Hmm.
course, there was an ulterior motive, which we found out later. He was acting as an agent for a supposed Mayan priest trying to sell this skull. But first time, well, I was interested. Pictures were sent to me. I was known as the staff archaeologist, prehistorian of the Rosicrucian Order. I said, it's fascinating. I'd heard about these things, know very little about it. But then I contacted John Zamora, and he promised he could actually bring the skull in for us to work with. I'll never forget the date because it's etched permanently in my memory. January 4th, 1980. He brought this crystal skull into the Rosicrucian Research Laboratory. Now, that was the first photograph I sent you. We can repost these photographs. I can do it myself. And when you repost this interview, I'll repost these pictures. He said it was called the Mayan crystal skull. Now, it was a cloudy quartz crystal skull, not clear, weighed about 8 pounds, not anatomically correct, but it looked like a skull that was carved in the face of a human skull. So he told us it was named the Mayan skull because of another person who had given the skull to, who had worked with it. And this was the first time I heard the name, F.R. Nick Nocerino. He had gotten this skull. He had contacted the priest who owned it, paid all the expenses for the skull to be brought to the U.S. And I found out that he had a research organization called Society of Crystal Skulls International. It had been incorporated in New York, 1944. I'm going to go much more detail into his life before we finish today. And incorporated in California, where he was living in 1945. The oldest known organization investigating these things. So I became very interested. Wow, what did he say? Well, my fault, I didn't contact him then. I was then given a flyer for a public lecture he was given. Nick Nocerino was the first person to give public lectures on the subject of crystal skull in early 1980. I didn't attend the skull. I still have the flyer, which is posted in the book I wrote. So first, I'm going to tell you what I'm talking about today. Again, I can give you a reading list of books on crystal skulls because there are many.
Sure.
But this book came out in 1988. Mysteries of the Crystal Skulls Revealed. 3 authors, Sandra Bowen, Joshua Shapiro, and F.R. Nick Nocerino. We'll talk more in detail about that because I'll get up to that point.
Photographic memory, by the way?
I have an encyclopedic memory. Photographic memory is different. Photographic memory means that you really know specific details. An encyclopedic memory means which like I could win PhD level in Trivial Pursuit, the game.
Yeah.
I know. In fact, one of my master's teachers told me that I suffer from cultural diarrhea, that I tried to learn too much about everything, but that's the way I am. I'm a Sagittarius Aquarius rising, which means I have to know a little bit about everything. But this book came out in 2008. I authored with David Hatcher-Childers. We were discussing a lot from this book today. Okay. So I heard about them. He brought the skull in. Oh, I was amazed to see a crystal skull. I felt a tremendous energy, a tremendous connection to it. So, because I was a staff research scientist, I had a list of people who were connected to the Rosicrucian Order. Now, we never, in professional use, used the word psychic. In fact, we hated the word. Because the word indicates, if I say you, Oriah, are psychic, that means somebody else is not.
That's correct.
And you're special, you're different. No.
Right.
We use the word sensitive. Okay? Because we're all born sensitive.
Right.
But, and you have actually posted some things about this, which is beautiful about channeling, and I'm going to continue. We're all born sensitive. Now, when we're children, many people, particularly little girls, always seem to have an invisible playmate. Somebody that they talk to that's not corporal, not physical. Now, sometimes when you tell that to parents, to mothers, people will react, especially if they're predominantly Christian or Muslim or Jewish and are very strictly religious, and say, oh, you got to stop that. Right. No, people will think you're crazy. You're talking to some visible people that don't exist, and it gets stifled. So if that sensitivity is not nurtured, not grows, it can lay dormant. And these sensitive people, children, never grow up to use their sensitivity as adults. However, if you're grown into a household like you were, like others are, when they say, well, that's okay, you keep your invisible playmate, that's wonderful, And they don't try to stifle your feelings, your sensitivity. You nurture it, you grow. Like your Riz, become a professional psychic.
Right.
Professional sensitive channel. Right. Okay. So we're all degrees of sensitivity, but I had a listing of people that were famous, were known with the Rosicrucian Order being sensitive. We brought them in. We did psychometry sessions. It was videoed. It was audio recorded. And we did questionnaires, which I found out later was a technique that Nick had adopted and used first with his group. He had hundreds of people involved with his group, all degrees of sensitivity. Everything was videoed. Everything was recorded, and fill out questionnaires. What did you see? What did you feel? And you take hits. In other words, you do then statistical analysis. We would say in the field of parapsychology, which is what this is, anything that's more than 50% accurate is statistically relevant. And we would get people 70, 80% accurate.
Mm-hmm.
So then we would see what people would say they saw in the skull, what they experienced. Everybody experienced tingling, electricity through their body. 80% of people heard jungle sounds and saw scenes of the Maya,
So
which is why...
still recording its environment?
Oh, you're ahead of the game. You're so good. We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that.
Okay.
You're really good. You're really good. We're going to say what crystal skulls were used for, of course, by ancient peoples. So 80% of people saw Mayan scenes. So that's why Nick had called it the Mayan crystal skull.
Mm-hmm.
I saw lots of Mayan scenes. I saw earth changes. We saw things that were beyond prehistorical events in these skulls. A lot of different things. So that was great. I then called in a famous person who was connected to the Rosicrucian Order. This is the second giant I'm going to talk about. Now, I always loved this expression by Sir Isaac Newton, who's one of my favorites.
Mm.
Isaac Newton would say, if I've been able to see further than other men, it's because I've stood on the backs of giants.
Yeah.
So I say, if you come with somebody like me, like somebody who's written books, and they don't talk about their teachers and the experience they've had of learning to get to this point,
right,
then they're not for real.
Right.
So I always venerate my teachers. As you know, we've spoken about Hakim every session we've talked about. Well, now we're going to talk about Nick Nocerino. Okay. And this other man, Dr. Marcel J. Vogel, who was a senior scientist at IBM in San Jose, lived in San Jose, California, and a high-ranking Rosicrucian. He had worked, his actual doctorate was in liquid crystals, in phosphors. And so he became an expert on crystals, and he was called in to work with the Mitchell Hedges crystal skull, another skull, which we found out that there were other skulls that were known. There's a skull in the British Museum, and there's a skull in the Paris Museum of Man, called the Trocadero Museum. One is called Aztec. They're both labeled Aztec. One is Aztec, one is not. We'll talk about that. So he had experience working with other crystal skulls. So Vogel came in, and he taught us techniques of how to work with crystals through breath, through sound, through color. Same thing Nick was doing. And he talked about a great theory, which I want to share with you. How crystal works, crystal itself, how it works storing energy. See, what we know is, one general thing which is going to verify with what you stated, the ancient peoples used crystals just like silicon chips are used in this machine we're talking on now, as ancient computers to store information, store knowledge, and pass it on to others, as well as healing, as well as many, many different things. So how does it work? Well, Vogel gave us a theory. And this theory is not metaphysics. It's not woo-woo. It exists in the science of crystallography. Crystal, quartz crystal, silicon dioxide, silicon atom bonded to two oxygen atoms. It forms a hexagonal shape called the Mogan David, the Star of David, which is the sign of Judaism. Six-sided shape. Okay. Now, what Vogel talked about, in the crystalline lattice of crystals, there can be defects. In crystallography, there are known as two defects, a line defect and a point defect. For our purposes, we talk about point defects. A point defect means that in this bond of silicon dioxide, the silicon atom can be missing. It's not there. It's empty space.
Interesting.
Vogel said that empty space can be occupied, because it's energy. Everything is energy, occupied by pulsed human thought. That you can put your energy, your concentration into a crystal, and it will be stored there. That's how it works as a computer.
So incredible.
And a point like this could have hundreds of point defects.
Ooh.
A crystal skull, like I'm going to show you here, we'll talk about her later,
Whoa.
can have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands
Do they
of
show up
tiny.
like little cracks?
No, you don't see it physically.
Can't see
You
it.
can only see it under a microscope
Got
in the
it.
lattice, the crystalline lattice. But this is how it stores energy. So yes, I will say to you, now I'm going to do another caveat, which I thought I'd start out with, but we're not going to get too deep into it. But as I told you, there are hundreds of books written about crystal skulls. I showed you some of them.
Right.
There are hundreds of people running around the world today, and you've interviewed some who talk about being experts in crystal skulls. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to mention names. I'm not going to say this. I will say a few things later to debunk certain things.
Mm.
But to be honest with you, most of the people in the world who say they have an ancient crystal skull don't have one. And I'm going to explain why.
Mm.
And more nonsense has been written about crystal skulls than actual truth. So we're going to go there. Because we always use science. And this is why I loved these two masters I'm going to talk about, Dr. Marcel J. Vogel and now F.R. Nick Nocerino, because they were scientists who used science and metaphysics together, which is where all the Rosicrucians, I could name for you a list of famous Rosicrucians in history, and many of them were the greatest scientists, like Albert Einstein, that exist in the world, like Nikola Tesla, in the world that have influenced us. So most of the great Rosicrucians were scientists too. So that's why I loved Rosicrucianism, because it was scientifically based. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Science, as well as metaphysics.
Mm.
Okay, so I got to learn about this crystal skull. I did all this work with it. It was great. He brought it in again for a second session in March. I featured Marcel Vogel and a man named Michael Campbell, who has passed away. So it's Dr. Vogel, rest their souls. And we had incredible sessions. Incredible things were coming out about this. But what we were finding from a lot of people who were sensitive, and they were getting a lot of negative reactions. A lot of people were frightened of it. A lot of people are frightened of crystal skulls to begin with, because in our Judeo-Christian Islamic view, a skull represents death.
Right.
And it represents something to be feared, not to the ancients. Now, here's something that's very interesting, some more science for you. Why a skull, people would say? Why a skull? Well, I would say a skull is where our brain is. The brain stores information. So it seemed natural to create a system with a thing that stores information, but there's more to it than that. It happens to be that the Mayan glyph, without the lower jaw, just the upper part of a skull, is the glyph for zero, which to the Mayans did not mean nothing, but everything, which is what zero really means. No beginning, no end. So it represents eternity, infinity to the Maya. Well, what do we know? Here's science. Now, here's the discipline of archaeology, particularly physical anthropology. What do we find, which I became very interested in as my background in physiology and anatomy. I could have been a great physical anthropologist. I probably am, but I just never went totally in that field.
I literally thought you were one.
I am, in essence. So what do we find when we dig up bodies of ancient, we do archaeology? Basically, when we find remains of ancient humans, we find the skull, or parts of the skull, or parts of the long bone, which is called the femur.
Mm-hmm.
Why? They do not disintegrate as quickly as the rest of the body does. They represent in alchemy, which is known as the fixed salt. Does not disintegrate when the rest of the body does. That's why we can find skull caps of humans or proto-humans, hominids, that are 3 million years old.
Mm-hmm.
Still there. So they knew that skulls represented eternity, longevity. So they were a powerful positive symbol to ancient peoples, not a negative symbol to be scared with. But why did so many of our sensitive have negative reactions, have scared? Well, we found out later that this particular skull, the Mayan crystal skull, used first by the Maya for healing, for knowledge, was later used by a tribe that conquered the Maya named the Toltecs. And the Toltecs performed human sacrifice. And they would cut open a person while they were still alive.
Oh my God.
Take out the beating heart, still beating, hold it up to the people and throw it down the steps of the altar. That's why so many of the Toltec temples have.
I stood on that pyramid in Mexico.
Yeah, Chichen Itza.
Yeah.
And
And I had children.
they had to clean all the blood off of it in modern times
Yeah.
because of all the hearts that were thrown down the steps. Well, then this particular skull was put in the cavity to the dying person and picked up those energies, the fear, the pain, the suffering. So we would tell people later that that's were the surface memories of the skull, that you had to learn to dive deeper to
Right.
get into the true knowledge and wisdom. And I'm going to talk about that again, because
Right.
now it's leading to it. Okay. They stopped my research. The Rosicrucian Order had a very negative view of what I was doing. This was too metaphysics. This was too out of the way for them.
Even
They
for the
said,
Rosicrucians. Wow.
well, because it was not a documented artifact. We had no provenance.
Right.
We couldn't establish, so they wouldn't display it in the museum. And they
Right.
told me to stop my research. Ended it.
Really?
Well, I got my revenge when I left.
Good. I hope so.
I took the whole file.
Good.
I took the tape. I have a reel-to-reel
So
tape
you're a
recording.
real Indiana Jones then.
Yes, sir. I stole, it's my file, and that's what's included in my book. You see, all my research is included in this book, and it was from the Rosicrucians. Okay, so I left the Rosicrucian Order, but I stayed in touch with this gentleman from San Jose, John Zamora. He stayed in touch with me. I tried to help him arrange. And the funny thing is, when I got involved in the business side of it, trying to help them, he claimed he was representing a Mayan priest who was in charge of a Mayan village and an Aztec village, and they were starving. So he claimed that the elders of the Maya, their spirit guides, had told him to release these objects to sell them because they could get money to feed the village.
I see.
They also had a bunch of horrendous, I can send you pictures of these, of jade artifacts, Mayan artifacts, Olmec artifacts, Aztec artifacts, which I got to handle and work with genuine, wonderful jade pieces.
Mm.
And pristine because they came from tombs.
Wow.
So that was it. But every time I got involved in the business end of it, trying to set up a wealthy woman in England, this and that, never always fell through. When I got inside that end of it, I saw there was greed.
The highest price that a crystal skull can go for?
I'll tell you in a minute. He said they would have sold it to the Rosicrucian Order for $100,000. The Rosicrucian Order would no way come up with that kind of money. So that never was going to happen. So I left the Rosicrucian Order. Then a year after that, actually it was in the fall of 1982, I got contacted again by the same gentleman, John Zamora. And he said the Mayan priest was in town and he had another crystal skull. Was I interested in seeing it? So you know what my response was then? Maybe you'll understand this. I said, does the Pope shit in the woods? Is a bear Catholic? People understand that. Of course. So I got rushed over with my friend to his house. I met the priest, who was named Francisco Reyes, did not speak any English, and I'm going to give you an example of this. And there was another skull, and it was the second one. I sent a picture of you to. We'll send a picture. We'll post a picture of it on this when we get the link. Total amethyst crystal skull. And
Wow.
amethyst is my favorite stone, being a Sagittarius. Purple. I love amethyst, and so I really resonated to this skull. Wow, connected to it. So I then had the brilliant idea to contact Nick Nocerino. I'd heard about him. I should have done it 2 years earlier when he was first lecturing about it, but it is what it is. Nick immediately responded on the phone. I've been looking for that skull since 1949.
No way.
And he knew Francisco. He was the one that paid all the expenses and brought him into the States. He lived in San Pablo, California, which is near Pinole in the East Bay, San Francisco. He rushed down to San Jose, rushed over to John Zamora's house with me, and he got to work with the skull. And I got to learn from Nick, and I got to watch him work. I'm going to send you
Shows a fly on the wall.
a couple of priceless photographs that are included in our book. I'll send them to you. Photographs I took of Nick working with the skull, and one taken of me watching of him work.
Wow.
I watched a master at work. A
Oh,
man,
my
he
God.
got it, and he got very emotional. He got very emotional. He would not speak afterward of what he received. It wasn't until years later that he told me what he got out of that skull. But I got to talk with him about skulls. And here's something. Marcel Vogel had said that the first crystal skull I talked about, the Mayan crystal skull, had been used by the ancients as a language decoder. That whatever language one spoke, translated through the skull would come out in a language that you would understand. And here it was demonstrated to me. I was talking with Francisco, and he didn't speak English. I don't speak Spanish. Only I can speak a little bit, a poquito of Spanish. Yeah, he was, John Zamora was acting as translator. So I asked Francisco a question about the Mayans committing human sacrifice. So he answered back in Spanish. So John Zamora said, but he looked directly into my eyes all the time he was speaking. Speaking Spanish or speaking Mayan, he was looking directly in my eyes. So John said, oh, he said the Mayans didn't often do human sacrifice. And I turned to him and said, no, John. He said the Mayans never did human sacrifice. And John said, I thought you don't speak Spanish. He put that message right in my mind. That's why I knew that the priest was legit. He was not fake. Maybe the story having to sell him was greed involved, but he was legit. And he taught me how to work with crystal skull, which I don't think we'll have time today. I'm going to demonstrate with my skull. It may be the next session, but I could show people how we work. Vogel taught us how to work with breathing. He would do, and you go into the crystal. Nick told us, and we used colors. We used what was known as a monochronometer in the Rosicrucian Research Lab. Would put out pure colored light, and we would hit the colored light on the skull. It loved certain colors like blue, green, purple, but it hated red. When we put red on the crystal skull, everybody got, the skull was angry. Everybody walked away from it. Didn't like red, but other colors, yes. And we find out now, crystal skulls are in all possible. I mean, I'm going to go on. There's so much information here. I mean, then researching the subject, I found that there are crystal skulls of every possible shape, size, every gemstone you can think of. And as you posted, there are crystal skulls made out of solid gold, out of silver, out of tin, out of glass, out of wood, out of every possible material you can think of. This has become a big industry. I knew some of the early carvers. There's a guy in South America, great carver. But since the 80s, the Chinese have been producing crystal skulls like you wouldn't believe. They're totally fascinated by them. So Nick said, yes, you can activate a crystal skull by breath, by light, and by color, and by sound. Very much by sound. When we would do chanting with the skulls, they would become very active, very alive, and kick off tremendous amounts of energy. So I fell in love with this amethyst crystal skull, and they had trusted me because 2 years before, in 1980, John Zamora linked to me, and he allowed me to have the Mayan crystal skull in my possession for a weekend. And I called in all my Rosicrucian friends. I recorded it, and I took psilocybin and went to journeying with, that's just the beginning. And I went journeying with the skull, and I loved the skull. But then we lost control of that skull. It was put on a loan to a lawyer in San Jose, and it disappeared. Later, years later, Nick told me that he had been tracked, because Nick could track these things. We're going to talk a lot about him. He could track these things. And he said it was out of the United States, somewhere back in Mexico, and he'd lost track of it. So now we had the amethyst skull, and they wanted to sell the amethyst skull. Again, they wanted to use me as an intermediary. A woman from England would call me, are you a real scientist? Yes, I have verified this skull. I believe it to be, as an archaeologist, a genuine ancient artifact. Now, Nick Nocerino, through the great work that he did, like I've said, I'm going to talk about his history, but he devised a system that we use for crystal skulls. Now, no matter what anyone else has told you, this is the information. He would divide it into 3 parts. A skull we would call contemporary was carved within the last 50 years. And like I say, there's literally hundreds of thousands of them out there now. You can go to any crystal shop anywhere in the United States, and you'll see crystal skulls there for sale. The Chinese have been producing them like crazy.
Right.
So, and most people who think they have an ancient crystal skull have one that's contemporary. Okay? Very easy to discern, which I was taught how to tell. But they have to be tested. You can't just look at a skull and say, oh, it's ancient. I can come real close because I have been trained but it needs to be tested. You have to work with it to know for sure. And this is why, because of the Mitchell Hedges skull. So he'd say, 50 years contemporary. What we call a skull that's old is older than 100 years, maybe a couple hundred years. Again, many of the ancient crystal skulls out there are old skulls. The Maya carved
So
many.
obviously we have to distinguish, you're saying old in the sense of the carving, because this crystal itself is ancient.
Ah, another great point. You're so anticipating what we're talking about. You're beautiful. What we call an ancient crystal skull is a crystal that has been carved into the shape of a skull over 1,000 years ago. But you're right. You just brought up a statement. Nick Nocerino sent me a letter in 1999 where he said to me, beware of those who can look at a skull and immediately say it's ancient. And he would say, all crystal is ancient. All crystal can store energy. Suppose you talk about Atlantean crystals, which people talk about, or Mayan, or Moog crystals from Lemuria, which are record keepers. Yes, all crystals are record keepers, but there are specific skulls, crystals that specialize in that. So yes, all crystals ancient. Okay. So they then gave me the amethyst crystal skull for a whole week. And man, if I could tell you what went on in that whole week, we'd be talking here for hours. But I called in again, all my Rosicrucian people. I had an audio tape recorder. I recorded everything that was in session. I have all these things stored. I called in a lot of people, crystal carvers, archaeologists, mystics, channels. I called in one of the most famous channels who was known at that time in the 80s, a lady in San Jose whose name was Clarissa Bernhardt. She was known as the earthquake lady because she could predict earthquakes. She was registered with the USGS. When she would get a hit, she'd call them up and say, it's going to be this magnitude, this is where it's going to be, and she was incredibly accurate. But what's really is a side story. She brought with her to her session her boyfriend. Her boyfriend was obviously, had been on a bender. He was suffering from a terrible, terrible hangover. Well, guess what? Do you know what the word amethyst means? It's a Greek word, amethystos. Do you know what it means? It means without drunkenness. It had been used by the Greeks and the Romans, the stone of amethyst, for hangovers. I didn't know that at the time. I gave the crystal skull for the guy to work with. Within 10 minutes, he said his hangover was gone. And he felt perfectly normal, just holding the skull.
Wow.
So she came up with great sessions. Most people came up with great sessions. We saw great stages of earth changes. Now, here what was key for me. I took a lot of psilocybin with the skull. I journeyed way out. I began to see, and because this is when I was deep.
By the way, we should share privately. We have to share stories of what
yes.
experience on psilocybin.
Of course. I had deep in my Egypt studies. Started out in the 1968, 70s. And this is 1983, okay? I began to see scenes of ancient Egypt. I saw the Sphinx, but she was surrounded by water and lush palm trees. But there were no pyramids. Then I saw, later I'd see another scene where I would see her again, the Sphinx in water, lush, and there were the pyramids in the background, but there was no desert. It was all palm trees and green.
What?
What the hell is this am I seeing? I had no idea what I was seeing. Well, 9 years later, look, I just told you, last month I celebrated my 28th anniversary of going to Egypt. 9 years later, I went to Egypt and met the great Commission Master, Abdel Hakim, and he began to tell me stories of ancient Kemet. And there it was, green and lush, pyramid being over 20,000 years old, Sphinx being over 56,000 years old. What the skull was showing me was scenes of ancient Kemet that Hakim would verify to me 9 years later, and is incorporated in my book. So can they show you the past?
Oh,
absolutely.
wow.
I saw scenes of the Knights Templars. The amethyst skull was supposedly a paperweight For the Mexican dictator Porfirio Diaz, part of the skull was missing. Amethyst is a protective stone. The most protective of all gemstones is amethyst. Protects you. If you have amethyst, you wear it. It protects an aura. It generates to your. It vibrates to your vibrational frequency, and it protects you. That's why all bishops wear an amethyst. Why the breastplate of Aaron, or which is known as the 12 tribes of Israel, 12 stones in the center, is an amethyst. Ancient peoples knew these things. So I loved this skull. I felt deeply in love with it, but I didn't want to get ego. I mean, if I wanted to have a skull, I would want this one. But again, the greed got fouled. This one, that one. It again was put on a loan.
Is that why people thought it had power? Because you get so enamored and you start talking and this starts talking back to you. So you start to.
This deals a lot with my wife's books, which people should read, novels, how crystals can be used by the light workers and by the dark workers. Of course, the dark magicians want crystal skulls to use as power stones. And her books are about a lot of that. She has a lot of great dark magicians that are featured in her books. So yeah, people want it for greed because they know it's power and it can make them powerful. But it fell through. And that skull disappeared.
That's where the exchange of like trying to purchase a skull, it gets
for negative energy. And again, the Mayan priest told us that the amethyst skull had a seal on it. It could not be used for negativity. It would bounce back to the person attempting it. Not the Mayan skull, which was used for perversion. We call these perversions. When the skulls become perverted, when they're used by the dark side for greed, for power, for control, they become perverted. But they record everything. Crystals will record in them, as I said, from this lattice defect theory, energy of every human being that touches them. They will record the events of everything they witness. That's why they are such incredible computers and record keepers. Why we can see such events.
So let me ask you a question. I have a question about this, very interesting. So if you
Go.
took that amethyst stone and you just put it on your desk, it would have a different vibration, different connotation than having it carved in a skull. So it's the actual symbol of the human skull and how we attribute, or what it has to be.
Why? I'll explain why to you. Because we are tuning our mind to the crystal. Crystal itself, as I said, silicon, there's silicon in our bodies. We're naturally attuned to crystals.
So we're not doing that when it's in its raw form.
But when yes, we are. That's why crystal balls became the first things the shamans used. They would polish them into balls, making them easy to use, and they would use the technique which is called scrying. Scrying is looking into a skull and seeing scenes. Again, I'm going to talk about him before I talk about his history. Nick Nocerino would explain, when you have a skull like the Mitchell Hedges skull, which is pure optical grade quartz, almost as clear as glass, you have to fog it with your mind to see scenes. When you have a skull like the Mayan crystal skull, which is already cloudy, you have to clear it with your minds to see scenes. Now, this is different than going into the skull. This is just superficial, which anybody can do. This is why all the great witches and shamans use crystal balls and can tell your future. They see scenes in there that could relate to you. And this is why they first started with balls.
So that's where that crystal ball came from.
But they carved them into skulls because that's even more familiar to us.
Right.
We recognize the skull as us.
Right, of course.
And we attune to them very quickly. And they attune to us very quickly.
I wonder if
so that's why they carved them into skulls, for attunement.
I was wondering if something with the pineal gland, when we're looking, because
you're jumping way ahead of the game. This is how we work with this. I'm going to demonstrate because Francisco showed me how to work with the skulls. It involves with the pineal.
I must be your apprentice.
You must be. You must. No, I think you've done this all before. But all I'm doing is waking up old knowledge that you know. There's a method, a technique of you working with crystal skulls where you make a triangle above their third eye, the pineal eye, and that's how you directly get the energy. I'm going to demonstrate that before we're done with the whole sessions.
Okay.
Okay, but now let's talk about this great master because I got to know him. He came to my house in San Jose, Nick Nocerino. I stayed in correspondence with him. We did a series of crystal skull conferences. A man named Chet Snow put on crystal skull conferences in the late 80s and 90s. I did them with Nick. I knew him up until he passed away in 2004. The last time I had a session with him was 2002, et cetera, et cetera. So he sent me letters. I have these letters. They're treasures of his knowledge he shared with me. He was going to write his own book on crystal skulls. Now, this book that I mentioned first came out in 1988. I'll explain how it came to be. It's got Nick's words in there, but he further elaborated on that with me later, because we both changed our opinions on the most famous skull I'm going to talk about. So, F.R. Nick Nocerino. Born on Halloween, 1926.
Nice.
So, for your astrology folks, and I know you have a resident astrologer in your group now. Nick was a Scorpio Leo rising.
And so my husband's a Leo Scorpio rising.
Aha. Those are
Or Scorpio Moon Virgo rising, sorry. That's
the most powerful combination that you could have. He was born on Halloween. Okay. Typically, he's born ostensibly in an Italian-American Roman Catholic family. His mother, particularly his maternal grandmother, were part of the ancient Wiccan tradition that came out of Italy. They had a coven. They were witches.
They were closer to being real witches than anything we have nowadays.
Absolutely, and still continues to this day. So Nick followed the Wiccan tradition. So here's a story he told later years, not in this first book. When he was born on the kitchen table in his home, surrounded by the women who were the midwives of his grandmother's coven. And they brought him into the world. And listen to this, even that you've never heard this, I'm sure. In the Wiccan tradition, they did not discard the placenta.
Right, I know about
they
this.
Took the placenta and stored it in alcohol in a jar. But what his grandmother did, she was known as a stregone, a great wise Wiccan woman. She put a bunch of crystals in with his placenta, and they were to become known as his birth crystals. When he was 8 years old, he went to her house. She presented him with the crystals into a necklace to wear around his neck for his whole life, for his protection, his birth crystals. She taught him how to use crystals for healing, the knowledge of crystals, and all the Wiccan tradition.
Wow.
So he started it. Nobody stifled his knowledge. In fact, it was emphasized. It was pushed. So he tells the story, which is included in my chapter. I have a whole chapter of him in the Crystal Skull book. When he was about 8 years old, he was walking up the stairs to his house, to an upper landing. All of a sudden, the upper landing changed into like a television screen. And he saw a crystal skull. It was the first time in his life. And being who he was, didn't scare him, didn't frighten him. Then he saw an amazing thing. Out of one eye came a cobra. Out of the other eye came a jaguar. And these were very important symbols from which he never forgot. And then he just disappeared. But he became fascinated with the idea of crystal skulls. So the story continues. 17 years old, he enlisted in the Navy right at the beginning of World War II. And he got into naval intelligence, which is key to understand the later history of Nick Nocerino. Okay. So he was assigned to a PT boat. He landed at Normandy well after the original invasion, D-Day. And he moved into France with his people. Okay. So he was in somewhere in southern France. I know exactly where he was. And he was with his friends, and they decided they wanted to wash up for having a meal. So they stopped at the well of this farmer, French farmer, and he took out the water, and he took off his shirt, and took off his birth crystals, laid him down to wash himself. When this French farmer saw his birth crystals, he went bananas. And he started yammering and jabbering at Nick in French, which of course Nick didn't understand. So he said, calm down, what is it, what is it? So they brought across somebody who spoke French to interpret, and this is the story. The Frenchman said he was part of a secret organization that had to protect something. They said, what? He ran out. He came back with a bundle in straw, opened it up, and there was a full-size cloudy quartz crystal skull. And he handed it to Nick. Nick, wow. Again, not scared. Immediately started to vibrate with the skull. And the story was that he told he was part of a secret organization that had protected this item for centuries, kept it away from the dark side. The Nazis were coming in. He was told by his masters that he was waiting for a courier to come to take the skull out of France, protect it. And he gave the skull to Nick and said, you're the man. But Nick, trusting his great intuition, said, I'm in a war zone. I can't carry this with me. It could get lost. So he respectfully and dutifully would decline the offer and said, you protect this, there will be another courier coming. I'm not the one, but thank you for sharing it with me. He later called that skull the blood of Christ because it had been with the Knights Templars. Oh, and he saw scenes in it. So he called that the Templar skull. He went. And again, Nick's intuition, which I could give you so many stories of him, and I will. He was right, because soon after this event, he was on his PT boat heading towards Italy, to land in Italy with the rest of the troops, and his boat was hit by friendly fire from a French gunboat and sunk.
No.
And he lost his birth crystals. He would have almost certainly lost the crystal skull if he had taken it. So he knew he was right. Again, he psychically tracked that skull for years. And he says today, the last I spoke to him, even in 2002, he still believed it was hidden in a cave in the south of France, and it was still protected. But he called that one the first real, genuine ancient crystal skull that he saw, the Templar skull.
Wow.
He got out of the service, became obsessed with crystal skulls, built New York City because he was from Brooklyn. 1944, he founded the Society of Crystal Skulls International. To the date that he passed, from 1944 to 2004, it was the oldest scientific organization testing crystal skulls.
Oh my God.
He came to California, reincorporated in California in 1945. Nick Nocerino then got the first degree, the first credentials to teach parapsychology in the state of California in 1948.
Mm-hmm.
And he became a great teacher. In fact, Nick...
What an incredible person.
Nick was known as the teacher of teachers. Excuse me. I usually see you after eating, and I sometimes He taught many of his students, like I said, wrote books on crystal, like Dale, the great Dale Walker, bless his memory, wrote a book called The Crystal Book. He was one of Nick's most devoted students. Many of his students became teachers of crystals, still teach crystals today.
Mm.
So he became, and he taught his first known public classes in parapsychology all through the 50s. But in 1949, he took a trip to Mexico to search these things down. And he always tells this story that during his journey, he saw over 450 different crystal skulls of all gemstones. Again, citrine, amethyst, we can go on and on, smoky quartz. I mean, you could go on and on, rutile, all the different types of quartz crystals there are. And they were all made into skulls. He said most of them were the size of a softball or ping pong ball. And most of them were carved by the Aztecs. Definitely what he called old crystal skulls.
Mm-hmm.
But in his journey, he got to see some large ones, particularly one that he always liked to talk about. He came to a Mayan village, and the Mayans, they acted like they recognized him. They showed veneration to him. Oh, we've been waiting for you. Waiting for me? We have a gentleman who's coming, one of our great masters. He has something you should see. Okay. He waited. All of a sudden, this Mayan priest came out of the jungle. Everybody bowed down and venerated him. He was highly respected. He had a bundle with him, wore around his neck. He opened it up, and Nick saw a full-sized, clear rose quartz skull that had a detachable jaw, like the famous Mitchell Hedges skull.
Whoa.
And he said it was bigger than the Mitchell Hedges skull, which I'll talk about, and more powerful than anything he had ever seen. And he said, this was a master skull And it's the first time he used that term. And he said, wow. And he tried to track that skull for many years. He said that skull was kept in a obsidian box. Obsidian blocks psychic energy. So he could not track it. But he believed it's still on the move. He would, in Guatemala, even to 2002, he was still psychically tracking this skull. He said that was the most powerful one. But then we started to talk about the Mitchell Hedges skull. Mitchell Hedges skull first appears publicly in the 40s, owned by a man named Mike Mitchell Hedges, a British soldier of fortune who did a lot of going around the Mayan villages, and claimed he had found this, he had gotten this skull. He called it the skull of doom. He had all sorts of fanciful stories. Now, as it turns out, Mike Mitchell Hedges was a teller of tales, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, he never said how he got the skull. But when he wrote a book called Danger, My Ally, published in the UK in 1954, said nothing about the crystal skull. It was then an American version was published in 1959, right before he passed away, by his adopted daughter, Anna Mitchell Hedges. She became the caretaker of the Mitchell Hedges skull. And she talked about it. He only spent 13 lines. He never said how he got it and where it was gotten from. Well, when someone does some actual research, finds out that this skull was known before. In fact, it was the first crystal skull ever tested by a scientific laboratory in 1936.
Wow.
It was tested with a skull that's in the British Museum, which is known as the British Museum skull, which is labeled Aztec, which Nick and I believe was older than that, but was not ancient. They tested it together and they couldn't find any tool marks, and they said they don't know how it could be made, and they were pretty murky. But the skull was called the Burney skull, B-U-R-N-E-Y, owned by a man named Sidney Burney, who was an art collector, who never revealed how he got the skull. But he had possession of the skull. So there's no evidence that Mike Mitchell Hedges, and I'm going to tell you why I'm bringing this up, ever had the skull before 1944. When Burney put it on sale at Sotheby's in London, Mike Mitchell Hedges bid 400 pounds on it and bought the skull. Now, years later, Anna Mitchell Hedges would tell the story that she found the crystal skull on an expedition with her father to a Mayan village in the early 20s. And this is the popular story that is told all the books I showed you. There's videos about this crystal skull. There's all sorts of stories. This is the story they tell, her story. She told at first that she found it in 1924. She found it under a city that they had named Lubantun, which in Mayan means City of Fallen Stones. Only that it was not the Mayan name for the site. Mitchell Hedges had named it that, supposedly. Okay, well, being who I am, I went into detailed research on the subject. And I began to find that there were a lot of holes on the story. Particularly, I have to bring it up to date. Okay, 1988, I got involved with the people who you saw who wrote that first book, Mysteries of Skull Revealed. Sandra Bowen, Joshua Shapiro. We learned that Anna Mitchell Hedges was going to have her skull on display at a conference in Sedona, Arizona. Boom, we rushed out there in caravans, and we rushed to see it. As soon as we got out of the parking lot, I felt that skull.
Oh my gosh.
The energy. Oh my God. And when I saw that skull on the table, it was like, so much energy. So much power. Now, I also have to back it up. In 1985, Nick Nocerino took a research team from his group in Pinole, California, Society of Crystal Skulls International, to Kitchener, Ontario, Canada, where Anna Mitchell Hedges lived. And he spent 2 weeks studying this skull with his team. And it was then that he began to have doubts. When he first talked about the skull in the early 80s, he said he thought it was an ancient skull, a master skull, because of the power. But he had problems with it. The problems were with the carving. I saw it in 1988, and immediately I started getting scenes and images. Wow, this is an incredible, powerful skull. But I had problems with it physically because it was carved from optical grade quartz. Now, the third skull I sent you a picture of shows all the rainbows and colors in it, but it's clear quartz, produces incredible amount of colors, colors that we don't even have labels for. But it was too clear. It was too anatomically similar to a human skull with a detachable jaw. I had problems with it because all the ancient skulls that I knew that Nick talked about were not carved for aesthetics. They were not carved to be sold.
I'm glad you're talking about this part.
You got to hear this.
That's
this is being taught for shamans to work with as talismans, as tools, not for sale.
Right.
So
and
they were
totally
ugly,
different carvings, right?
And crudely carved.
Right.
The teeth were not clear. The
Right.
Mitchell Hedges' teeth had very clear dentation. So I had problems with it.
Yep.
But everybody was talking about it. So Anna Mitchell Hedges, she got upset. You know, she, like many people who we call caretakers of crystal skulls, they become very obsessed about their own skull. So she got pissed off that we would talk about other skulls. Her skull was anyone's important. So she got mad at us. So 1995, there's another skull I'm going to talk about in great detail called Max, the Texas crystal skull. But these skulls were invited to the British Museum to be tested, along with some old skulls, a Smithsonian skull. I'll go into more detail about this when I talk about Max. But it was then that Anna Mitchell Hedges was invited to bring her skull to be tested, and she refused. She said it had been tested enough. But what had happened in 1988 when she gave a presentation of the skull, she had changed her story. She had told Frank Dorland, the guy that she had loaned it to in 1970, he brought it to Hewlett-Packard Laboratories. Hewlett-Packard Laboratories was the other scientific organization besides Nick's and the Rosicrucians and the British Museum were the only scientific organizations that have ever tested. You'll see stories about the Smithsonian has tested these skulls. This is an absolute lie. The Smithsonian has never tested any of the ancient skulls. So they couldn't determine anything. But so she wouldn't have it tested. But in 1988, she changed her story. She had a documented, a verified document saying that she found it in 1924, and she found it on an altar, and then she found the rest of it a couple of weeks later. Here in 1988, she was telling a different story. Then she found it on her 17th birthday. Well, since we know she was born in 1907, her 17th birthday would have been 1924. But she said she found it in 1926 to Frank Dorland. So she was changing the story. Okay, I researched the expedition. The expedition that went to Lubanton was known as the Thomas Gann expedition. Thomas Gann was a doctor, an MD, who was an amateur archaeologist who was connected to the British Museum, and they had sent him to the Mayan sites. So Mitchell Hedges might have joined along, but it wasn't the Mitchell Hedges expedition, like she had said. And during the documentation, he wrote a book about it. Captain Joyce, who was the head of the expedition, a woman named Lady Richmond Brown, who financed the expedition, they all wrote books about it, and they never mentioned finding a crystal skull or Anna Mitchell Hedges being part of the expedition.
Interesting.
So the conclusion that Nick Nocerino came to 1999, shared with me, and I shared with him, is that she made up the whole story. She was never at Lubentun. That skull is not a Mayan skull. It was not found by the Maya, and it's an old skull.
So your instincts told you that?
Yeah, because of the way it's carved. I can show you, I've seen as many as 9 items that I would classify as genuine ancient crystal skulls. I'm going to talk about as many with them as you. We'll go to another session if we have to, the ones that I work with. Nick said, before he passed away, he had seen as many as 18 skulls that he would classify as genuine ancient skulls.
Wow.
Neither one of us classified the Mitchell Hedges skull as one of them. He did further investigations. Now, here comes the story, which you've heard from other sources. When Nick was first working with the Mayan skull with his group, a lot of his people reported seeing a particular image. A scene of 12 skulls in a circle with a master skull in the middle. This is the legend of the 13 crystal skulls. When I did my work with my Rosicrucian people, they also saw the scenes. So did I. 12 crystal skulls. However, the idea that there are 13 original crystal skulls all coming from different extraterrestrials who brought it to this planet is pure myth.
Mm-hmm.
No evidence
I
whatsoever.
could just say that's pure myth, just you saying it. I could feel that.
It doesn't mean there's not an extraterrestrial
Right.
or interdimensional
Always
connection,
qualifying.
which we will talk about.
Yes.
But no, there were no 13 original skulls. What we saw were sets of 13. There would be 12 minor skulls around a master skull. And that master skull would download to all. What we know about quartz in general and crystal skulls in particular, as they will always go, which is a law in chemistry, a law in physics, the higher energy, higher source only goes down to the lower source. When two crystals meet and one crystal is older, has more knowledge and information, it naturally downloads that to another crystal.
Mm.
I didn't bring it. I'll bring it next session. I have my own medicine pouch, of course, which I carry around with me all the time with crystals, a small crystal amethyst skull in there. I have a little amethyst that was given to me by a gift by a woman I'm going to talk about. That amethyst has been with every ancient crystal skull I've been with, except the first one, the Mayan crystal skull. So it's downloaded from every one of them. I want someday to take this piece of amethyst and drop it right into your Riz's left hand. Have him close his hand.
Do you know what happens when he holds on?
Then let him go for hours. He would go for hours.
He just gets tingles and chills and.
I know. And I can arrange for him to be with ancient skulls, which I'm going to talk about.
Yes.
There are a few that still go around and are still available to the public to be seen. Okay, so there were sets of 12 with a master skull. Both Nick and I felt Max, who we're going to talk about, and the skull he has, and a couple of others, particularly the rose quartz skull he saw in Mexico, were genuine master skulls. They're the very oldest. Thousands and thousands. I cannot put a date on them. So now we go to this next one because I want to finish this on this first session with you.
Mm-hmm.
This was 1988. I got to see the Mitchell Hedges skull. Well, the year before that, 1987, I was invited to go to San Francisco Whole Life Expo. I lived in San Jose. It was a pretty easy trip. Nick Nocerino was going to be lecturing. It was my first opportunity to hear him lecture about crystal skulls. And there was going to be another skull there. So sure, I went. And a great moment. I'm getting emotional because speaking of Nick, he paid me a great moment of respect. He was in the middle of his lecture. I came late. So I came in the back quietly, didn't want to disturb you, tried to sneak in and see. He was in the middle of a talk. As soon as Nick saw me, he interrupted the talk and introduced me to the audience. And I was, what honor. That was such an honor. And so I sat down, and his lecture was incredible. So there was a crystal skull there, which at that time was known as the Texas crystal skull, owned by a woman, a couple who still live today in Houston, Texas, and have this skull, Carl and Joanne Parks. Nick had become friends with them because I got to tell her story. Now, I'm going to do this briefly because I recommend to everybody you get a chance to hear Joanne Parks talk and present Max. I mean, today compared to what it was then is night and day. It's amazing. But this is her story. And Nick knew her story. That's why he found it. She, her husband, Carl Parks, a wonderful gentleman, Vietnam combat war veteran, and I'm a Vietnam veteran, so we had that connection. He was a furnisher. He would furnish, restore. So he finished some furniture for a Buddhist monastery, Tibetan Buddhist monastery, which was in Houston, Texas. It was called the Ling Monastery. Then they had a daughter. Her name was Diana. I think she was 12 at the time. She was diagnosed with inoperable bone cancer.
Mm.
All the doctors told her there was nothing could be done. She has about 3 months to live. Prepare yourselves. But Joanne's a stubborn lady. She didn't want to just accept that. She said, well, there's got to be something else we can do. So they went to alternative healers, alternative, nothing worked. So she was told by her husband that they had this peculiar thing that was there in this monastery, sitting on a pedestal in the middle. And the Tibetan monks used it for healing. So take Diana there, maybe they can do something. And he became very friendly with the head monk, who was named Norbu Chen.
Mm.
But he was not Tibetan. He was American. He was the first, and as far as I know, only American who was initiated into the red hat Tibetan Buddhist lineage and learned tremendous amount of ancient healing techniques of the Tibetan Buddhists. And they used crystals. So Joanne met Norbu, and Norbu took a great interest in her. Immediately took a great interest in her. And he said, our daughter, she said, bring him in. Bring her in. Nothing we will do will harm her. Bring her in. They brought her in. They meditated with her. They chanted with her. They put crystals with her. Norbu took Max, who was on the altar. They was just known as the crystal skull at that time, and gave it to her to hold. Now, did not cure her, but she was able to live 3 more years.
Aww.
When they said she had 3 months, and she died peacefully without pain.
Wonderful. Wow. That's incredible.
So she watched these Tibetan monks and she became fascinated with them. So then in 1980, this was, Norbu told him, Joanne, he was going to pass away soon. And he was going to give the crystal skull to her. She said, what? He said, you don't know what this is. You don't know what to do with it, but one day you will.
Right.
And they didn't believe him. He passed away, and in his will, he bequeathed the skull to Joanne. So she just called it a rock at that time, a rock with a face on it. They didn't know what to do with it. She put it in a shoebox, put it in a closet, and it sat there for 10 years. 10 years.
Oh my gosh.
But all the time she was having dreams.
Mm.
And in the dreams, the skull would come to her and talk to her. And would say to her, you don't know who I am, but I'm very important. I have an important mission for humanity. You have to find the man. That's what he would say to her over and over. You have to find the man. What did she say? I must be going crazy. She was a Lutheran housewife, moderately religious. She could, what is this? Talking skull. She called it a talking rock. I have a talking rock. That's all. Okay, skull, don't bother me. Wouldn't stop. Persisted even in the daytime, where she thought she was really going crazy because she wasn't dreaming anymore, but it was talking to her. And the skull would say to her, by the way, my name is not Rock, it's Max. She said, oh my God, I got a talking rock and he tells me his name is Max. You have to hear Joanne tell the story the way she tells it. Anyway, she was watching television one day. There was a documentary on from the Houston Museum which showed a crystal skull. And she went, oh my God, I got one of those. She called up the museum staff and said, hey, I got one of those things you guys are showing. They said, what? What are you talking about? Bring it in. Let us see. They brought it in. Archaeologists, anthropologists looked at it and they had nothing to say. They had never seen anything like that in their life. Now, Max is big. Max at the time we thought was the biggest skull we'd found, 18 pounds of a cloudy quartz crystal.
Wow.
And Max is totally unique because most of the skulls are carved from a single piece of crystal, not Max. He's fused by 5 different forms of crystal, fused together. So that it's different. He's very different than any other crystal skull. But
Wow.
again, crudely carved, not carved for selling, carved for use.
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't know what to do with it. They said, okay, well, you guys can't help me go home. I said, well, wait a minute. There's a guy that we've been in contact with. He lives in California. He's involved with these things. You should contact him. Well, I don't know. We'll give you his name. Okay, Nick Nocerino was his name. She says, okay. Called him up one time, started talking. And you had to know Nick. I mean, he was a typical Brooklynite until the day he died. Now, what that means, because I'm born in Brooklyn. Your Riz was born grew up in the Bronx. But the thing is, most New Yorkers think they're different than everybody else in the United States. People born in Brooklyn think they're different from all other New Yorkers. So we have that Brooklyn attitude.
True, it's true.
Okay. So I raised in the Bronx, but I'm born in Brooklyn. So immediately she says to Nick, I got one of those things, a rock with a face on it. He says, oh yeah, everybody's got one. I mean, that's his typical attitude. Oh yeah. So then he says, describe it to me. She says, oh, well, it's a rock with a face on it. Then she says, it has this particular Jewish skull cap on it, like a yarmulke. She said, he got very silent. He didn't speak for a long time. She said, hello, are you still there? He said, you have the skull with the white cap? She said, I just described it to you. He said it again. You have the skull with the white cap? She said, yes. She said, I've been looking for that skull since 1949. What's your address? I'm on my way. He flew to Houston, verified it, the skull, and told her it was an ancient skull, and that she had a tremendous thing to work with. But don't worry, the skull would tell her what to do. And that began a great friendship between Nick Nocerino and Joanne.
Is this story online somewhere we can listen to Joanne tell the story?
She tells the story. She was supposed to write a book, and she never did.
Maybe is there something maybe on YouTube? Maybe she's...
I don't know that she has, but
maybe
she will.
She's still alive?
Yes, and she goes, I'm telling you, she goes around with the skull still. She's come to L.A. She's come to L.A.
We should have her on.
I will make the arrangements.
Okay. She needs to tell the story.
There's another one. Oh, she does. She does it at her presentations. Everybody knows it. Because then when she hung up, the skull talked to her again. He said, congratulations. You finally found the man.
Oh.
And the skull said to her, by the way, my name is not Rock, it's Max.
Oh my gosh.
And I'm going to tell you.
Why is that making me emotional right now?
He told me later, I have to tell you so much more. He told me later years why it's Max. I'm going to tell you. People don't know this, that know this. Joanne doesn't tell this story. I do. But she said, and by the way, we have a lot of work to do. So then he began to channel to her. He began to download all this incredible information to her, and she started doing public. In 1987, she brought it first publicly to the San Francisco Life Expo. So here I'm going to show you some more detriment. Okay, Nick introduces me to Carl and Joanne Parks, tells them who I am. Now, what they were doing in those days is they would have a little tent. Max would be in another little side tent. People would pay, $10 to get into the, maybe another $1 or $2 to Max and Joanne, and they could have a 10-minute session with Max. Nick told them who I was. Carl said, go ahead in. They let me have all the time I wanted. And Max immediately connected to me. Like, hey, pal, I'm an old friend. I know you. You know me. We worked together before. I know you. And I fell in love with Max. And I'm going to tell you even more why. And so it was an incredible experience.
Wow.
And I got to see Joanne do sessions. So years went by. This is 1987. Now we skip 10 years to 1997. I'm then living in Boulder, Colorado. Actually, I'm still living in Colorado Springs, Colorado. I'd become friends with two great people, Joe Swanson and Mary Lee Swanson. Joe has passed away, rest his memory. Beautiful, beautiful man. They became friends with the Parks. They were crystal dealers. They had a crystal store. They actually had a website called Crystals. So they became friends. They saw Max. They became friends with the Parks. So 1997, Mary Lou Swanson calls me up, and she says, Joanne's coming to Boulder with Max. Would you want to see him? And my first response is, well, I've seen Max more than any of the others. I've seen him a lot of times. Maybe, I don't know. A voice came into my head, which was Max, said, maybe you're going to meet someone interesting. Okay. I had just gone through a breakup, a painful breakup, and I was in a depressed state. I said, okay, well, maybe I'll meet somebody. Short story, and you have to hear the long story. When you will interview my wife, you will get the long story.
I knew you were going to say that.
Because when I went up there, and I saw Max, all of a sudden, a blonde lady comes in from outside with a plate of food. It was a potluck. And she looks at me and said, "Who are you and what are you into?" I said, "Well, okay, sit down, we'll talk." And I told her I was into Egypt, really big. And she said to me, "Well, you know, I'm not really into Egypt." So the first thought in my mind, well, this is not going to go anywhere. But then she said she was really into the Maya. And Mayan, she felt a real Maya, and she had seen Max before. And that's why she came back. And Max had really connected to her. So I said, well, this is interesting. So she can tell you the story. She tells it better. But Max put us together with simply what it was. Max, other things that you can hear, you will tell that crystal skulls have done, they have brought people together. And so through the years, we would go see Joanne many times. She'd come to Colorado Springs. She'd come to Boulder. And every time I would see Max, he would say to me, "Okay, pal, I put you together with this woman, and now you're supposed to do something. You guys are supposed to do something for humanity. Work together." Well, what it is Teresa has a PhD in English. She teaches writing, as well as British literature, as well as a New Age novelist.
Oh my goodness.
Visionary of Mel. So she edited all my books. The reason why a lot of people read my books and say, "Wow, they're really well written," not me, because of her. Yeah. Especially the first book. My first book, Land of Osiris, we argued and fought about it a lot because I was stubborn. "No, I want to say it this way." "No," she'd say, "You can't say it that way. You have to say it to people." And we fought. But I came out and saw the book. I said, well, she was right all along. So when we come back to doing a second book, I was much easier with her. She'd tell me, "Change this, do this or that." I would, "Yes, ma'am," and do it. And the same with the Crystal Skull book. She edited and why it's beautifully written chapters. But then she told me she was into writing visionary fiction. She wanted to write stories like Dan Brown, with crystals, with ETs, with interdimensionals, with all sorts of Egyptian mythology, Mayan mythology, Aztec mythology. I said, well, I could help you with that. That's my stuff, girl. And so her books are so rich because of what I put into it. And she actually took Hakim as a character in her first book. See, people who are reading her current novel, which is incredibly written, have to read a series. The first book is called Under the Stone Paw, which takes place with a series of crystals. Crystal keepers have to come together to make significant changes in the earth, and they have to go to the Egyptian sites, and there's an Egyptian teacher who comes in with a crystal. She based that Egyptian teacher on Hakim. And the hero is a man named Michael Levy. Doesn't look like me. She's with black hair, looking like a typical Jew, but he's a Jewish Egyptologist. Hello? Where did she get that from? So that's the story.
That's
so Max is
it's incredible.
So of course Max is Teresa's favorite skull because she still talks to Max all the time. She has pictures of Max all around her room. I mean, Max was so close to us. We haven't seen him in a couple of years, but she saw him just a couple of years ago, and it's always the same thing. "Okay, I put you guys together. You have to keep working." So she keeps pumping out the novels. I keep editing, tell her, "Okay, you got to change this. Okay, Hakim would have said this instead of saying that." And she tweaks the novels with things I give her, and that's where they are. And so
incredible.
Max.
Well, we have like 20 minutes. Do you want to do that?
No, because we have to keep going.
Demonstration?
Max, no, I'm going to do it next time.
Okay.
I'll show you brief. Maybe I'll show right before we get off. I'll show it, but briefly. Okay, 1988 is Max. Well, great. I'm more powerful for it. But then there were others that came in. Like I said, we just did these crystal skull conferences. In fact, we did a crystal conference on the day that you and Riz got married. 11/11/11.
No way.
That's when I got in touch with Kendall Morgan, who you have interviewed. He put on a series of crystal skull conferences. 999, I wasn't at that one. But 10/10/10 in New York City, I went to that one. 11/11/11, I was at that one in LA, in a hotel right next to LAX. We did this conference. So crystal skulls came from all around. Joanne Parks didn't come. She didn't bring Max. But Dale Walker and his wonderful wife, Lori, brought their skulls, and they have ancient skulls. There was another lady named Yoki Van Dieten. She had 8 skulls. And then there was another lady that brought another skull. This is what I wanted to talk about. Now, Nick had told me about all the crystal skulls he worked with, and that's in the book. And it's in his book, the first book, Mysteries of Crystals. He talks about the different crystal skulls he had seen up until 1988. But in the 90s, he told me he had seen some other skulls. He told me, this one's a master skull, that one's a master. And that's when he decided the Mitchell Hedges skull was not an ancient skull, but it might have been copied after this rose quartz skull he had seen, which was a master skull. But he said there was other skulls. And he said, and then there's Einstein, he named it, and another one, which are genuine skulls, but I can't talk about it. And I always wondered, why wouldn't you talk about it to me? Well, I later found out that the person that had that skull didn't want it public at that time. So he kept his promise, and he didn't speak about it. But he said to me, he thought it was a genuine master skull. So here at the conference in New York, 10-10-10, lady named Carolyn Ford, who lives in Sedona, Arizona, came with Einstein. And we thought Max was the biggest. Einstein is 33 pounds.
What?
Of cloudy quartz crystal. The last pictures I sent you, and I will post them again on this link, of me working with Einstein. So I saw this skull and I said, whoa, this is the one Nick talked about. And she knew who I was because Nick had told her about me. She said, yes. You want to hold him and play with him? I said, yes. And again, I can demonstrate the techniques. It's very easy for me to go inside a crystal skull because I have been taught by masters. But I can teach anyone to do it. Anyone can do it.
Wow.
Einstein was incredible, full of energy and stories and ancient civilizations. Whoa. So I've been friends with Carolyn Ford. Teresa and I went up to Sedona because we were doing conferences there. This is probably 10 years ago, 2010. And that's where the pictures were that I sent you. I got to really test and work with Einstein. No doubt Einstein was a master skull. In fact, I was convinced that the first skull I saw, the Mayan crystal skull, because Einstein had these indentures in the side of his head, like the amethyst skull had and the Mayan skull, but Max and none of the others have had. I was convinced that the Mayan crystal skull had been one of the 12 around Einstein as the master skull.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
So I've since seen others.
I'm surprised you don't own a skull.
Not an ancient one. We do have skulls. This is
no. You do? That's right. What am I saying?
That's
now, tell me the story on that skull.
This is a contemporary skull. It's a modern carve. Okay. Because it's amethyst, I love it. She loves me. She's so glad. I have worked with it often. I did lots of things with it, but I have not worked with it in years. So she's a little miffed at me.
Does she talk to you?
Of course. But she has been a little miffed that I haven't worked with it. Now she's glad that I'm working again, showing how to work with it. She wants me to work with her again, and I will. I have let it go. I got out of the crystal skull field, again, because of all the nonsense and the phonies there are in the field. I backed away. Nick Nocerino made a statement. I don't go after crystal skulls. They come to me, which was true. Once he was known, people would contact him all over the world, not just U.S. I have a crystal skull. I want you to look at it. Send me pictures, blah, blah, blah. People have done, since I came out, everybody was sending me pictures of crystal skulls, contacting me. But I pulled away in the last 5, 6, 8, 10 years. And so not as often do people send me pictures of crystal skulls, but I've seen them. I've seen a lot. Again, most of them are contemporary or old, not ancient. So I began, Einstein was another one, and Einstein is beautiful skull. So that's what Nick had talked about. So she lives in Sedona. She has gone around with Max. People can make contact with her. Sometimes she's discerning and she won't let just anybody come, but she lets people deal with Einstein. Joanne Parks, since 1987, has been going around the country. She doesn't like to fly. So she only went to England once because the British Museum to test her skull. And when they tested it, they had nothing to say about it. They couldn't debunk it. They debunked all the other skulls they had there as being contemporary or new, but they couldn't debunk Shana Ra, which I'll tell you about, which is Nick's skull, and Max. They couldn't, so they said nothing. They had no comment because they couldn't debunk it. So Joanne goes around. Now with COVID, she's not been going around, but she's been to crystal stores in LA. She's been all over California, all over the country. People that usually have crystal shops or metaphysical stores call her in. She does a weekend. She charges people to come. She charges people to have sessions with it privately. Some people feel it's well worth the money. It's not being greedy. It's just to cover her expenses and her living. all that, whatever. But Max has been the most public of all the genuine ancient skulls.
Mm-hmm.
But as I said, Nick Nocerino was contacted by a group of psychic archaeologists in 1995 who were going to be doing a dig in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted him to come along to use his abilities. Why? I forgot to mention this. As I said, Nick Nocerino became very publicly and very famous, more than just crystal skulls. If people think it's just crystal skulls, they're ignoring the life of this great man who was one of the great teachers of metaphysics that ever existed. Again, teacher of teachers.
Wow.
So he was public. He was on the Johnny Carson show. He was on television. There was In Search of done about him because he was known as a psychic detective. Call him in, and he also would debunk haunted houses. He was one of those that would go in and de-haunt houses, get away the spirits, and have the spirits to move on. He was famous for that.
Right.
Here's a quick story that I want to tell because, like I said, we use sound to activate the skulls. So there's a famous so-called New Age musician, contemporary musician named Stephen Halpern. Has many video CDs.
I know who he is.
Okay, people say we look alike.
Yeah.
Because at one time my hair was out like this, and they would confuse. I met Stephen, we're good friends. So he was connected with Nick and Society of Crystal Skulls International. So he brought Stephen Halpern in. He brought in Peruvian whistles, little musical sounds, and they did musical experiments with the crystal skulls. And so he was connected to Nick. Okay, long story short, Stephen had his car stolen in San Francisco. So he went to the police department. They couldn't find it. Had no leads, nothing. He called up Nick. Nick, can you help me? He said, describe the car to me. Describe the car to me. He got quiet. He said, you go under this underpass in this town that's south of San Francisco.
Oh my gosh.
On so-and-so street, there's your car. He went, and there was his car. It was wrecked, of course, but there was his car. And I could go on and on with stories of Nick doing these things. He was one of the most, again, we hate the word psychic, but he was one of the most famous psychics. Again, on Johnny Carson show, he was known. He was great. So Nick could track these skulls. He tracked a lot of them. He knew what they were, where they were going. And so Nick came to me in 2001 when we did this conference, and we talked in detail about the Mitchell Hedges crystal skull. And then he was at the conclusion, it was not an ancient skull, but a very powerful crystal. He believed that skull had been taken to Mexico. He believed that skull was carved in a town in Germany, which today is known as Idar Oberstein, Germany. At the turn of the century, Idar Oberstein, Germany, was known as the greatest source of crystal carving in the world, especially in Europe, but in the world. Great crystal carvers. Did magnificent carvings. And when the Nazis took over in 1933, the two cities combined became Idar Oberstein, Germany. Even today, it is known as a center of great crystal carvers in the world. So Nick Nocerino took a visit to Idar Oberstein, wanted to investigate. Has anybody known if there was a crystal skull carved here? Anybody have a family name? He couldn't find that information. However, he saw priceless carvings in optical grade quartz crystal, equal quality to the Mitchell Hedges skull. And it was known that the Germans, of course, had many excursions into South America in the 19th century. Again, Emperor of Mexico was Maximilian in the 1880s. He was of Austrian. He wasn't Mexican, he was Austrian. So they began bringing quartz crystal out of Brazil, out of Mexico, and they were carving. So they were great carvers. So he believed, and I trust his belief, that the Mitchell Hedges skull was carved in Idar Oberstein, Germany, probably late 19th century, early 20th century. However, he believed German soldiers of fortune took it to Mexico and brought it among the Maya, and the Maya brought out their skulls, and their skulls downloaded into the Mitchell Hedges skull. So the Mitchell Hedges skull does contain ancient memory, but it's not its own.
That is
downloaded.
interesting. That is fascinating.
So even today, Mana Mitchell Hedges passed away in 2007. She was 100 years old. To her death, she maintained the fantasy that she had found the Mitchell Hedges skull. It's still in the popular literature today. Anybody talks about it, oh, it was found by Anna Mitchell Hedges and at this Mayan site. No, it's not a Mayan skull. The Mayans never carved it. But it is a powerful crystal, without a doubt. As you yourself said, all crystal is ancient, all crystal contains energy, and how it can be done. So we can stop, and I can show you, because I had many sessions with Francisco, the priest. He said to me, you want to see how we, the priests, work with us? Yeah, sure. Okay. So you take a crystal skull, and first you got to tune to it. You got to look into its eyes, into its face. Breathe into it. Sometimes you put your third eye on its third eye, which you can see I'm doing with Einstein in the picture I sent you. But then to work, turn the skull around, put it on your navel, and make a triangle above its third eye, and breathe with the skull. See, she already let me in. I'm in. And that's how you do it.
That's incredible.
So there's a difference between scrying and channeling with a skull. And this is for Riz to know. Scrying, anybody can do. You take the skull.
Because you just
Now,
read it.
you can't do it with amethyst because it's opaque. It can only be done with quartz, cloudy quartz or clear quartz, or with citrine, or with a skull that's light amethyst that you can see through. And you hold the skull and you start breathing, concentrating, breathing, concentrating. And if it's a clear quartz, like the Mitchell Hedges skull, all of a sudden it'll appear cloudy. And you can see scenes. You can see oceans. You can see figures. Now the figures, overwhelmingly, that people have seen in crystal skulls appear to be extraterrestrial.
Whoa.
Appear to be. The tall grays, the small grays, all the types of beings that you've heard from the literature have been seen in crystal skulls. However, we, Nick, myself, and other people felt there was other things working. Now, for example, Max, and I'm going to end now. Max seemed to have a personality. He seemed to have, he would be a joke. He was a jokester. He would tell jokes. He'd make you laugh. So it seemed like there was a personality. However, there seemed to be something else to me, that there was an interdimensional energy that would use Max to channel to us.
You know what? How hard it was for me to be silent about that, to let you say that, because I was getting that the whole time.
I'm glad, because you were obviously someone who worked with skulls before.
I immediately knew that's what was happening. It was interfacing.
Now, crystal skulls call to you. You can't go.
Yeah.
But you should have one.
I definitely should have one.
And how you will have one is you go into a shop that has crystal skulls, and one will talk to you.
Okay.
One will speak to you and say, "Take me home."
Yeah, I could see.
That's your skull.
I could see which one it is already. It's clear and it's white. So that's the one that's waiting for me, and it's about this big.
So the idea of ETs and interdimensions, we'll talk about in greater detail when we go into that subject, but definitely
I am so looking forward to part 2, because I would love to take off from this part and go into how it's an intermediary. Yeah.
Sure. So they're used, so they see. But now I end with this thing that Max told me years ago, which he never told Joanne. Okay, why Max? Well, he told me that the Spanish-speaking people called them El Viejo, the old one, the ancient one.
Right.
But he said it comes from the Mayan word Imash, pronounced Imash, but spelled, if you know Mayan, I-M-A-X, pronounced Imash. He said that meant the ancient one in Mayan. So listen to what he was saying, and I write that in the book. Imash, I-M-A-X. He was saying I-Max. That's how he told her his name was Max. From Imash, the old one in Mayan.
Oh,
I-Max.
that's so special.
That's privileged information.
How beautiful to end on that note.
It's not privileged anymore, but there's zillions of people who've seen Max that don't know that. Joanne didn't know that when I told her, but she said, yeah, that makes sense.
Throughout this whole talk, I got emotional so many times.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's
I
personal
just
connection.
felt very, very.
I'll,
I
you
felt the extraterrestrials. I
you have
felt how much it's being used.
both you and Riz have to see Einstein and or Max,
Yeah,
because the
definitely.
reaction you
Well,
will
I would
have,
want to film it. I would
he'll
want to.
have to he'll have to he'll have to pick you up off the floor.
Well, I
You
could feel
first
that
see
I'm just
that.
going to be in tears. I'm just going to be crying.
Many people do.
Yeah.
Many people do. Many people do.
How
I get
incredible.
emotional when I think about them sometimes.
Oh, what a story. I was just
So,
so
and the
grateful.
greatness was to talk about Nick Nocerino, because, of course, I put Hakeem here, but Nick Nocerino was the greatest master of crystal skulls who ever lived, but he was so much more than. And his name is not known as much today as it should be. Again, his daughter, oh, let me confess, I said 1996, he was called to Mexico. He did his psychic ability. He said, dig here. They dug down a simple thing, and he found a bunch of crystal skulls. Dale Walker got one of them, and they gave one to Nick. It is known today as the Nocerino crystal skull. He called it Shana Ra, based on an ancient teacher of his. So Michelle Nocerino still lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. She goes around. So there's 3 skulls we're talking about. Carolyn Ford has Einstein in Sedona. Joanne Parks has Max in Houston, Texas. And Michelle Nocerino has Shana Ra, the Nocerino crystal skull in the San Francisco Bay Area. They all 3 show the skull. They're all on Facebook. You can connect with them and maybe make arrangements to see them. Next time Joanne comes to LA, you have to go see him.
Well, I could go see the one in San Francisco. I could just drive up there.
If you contact Michelle first.
Yeah, I mean, obviously.
Has to
But you
be
would have
okay.
to help me with that.
I would.
Okay.
All you would have to do to her is say to her, Stephen Mehler sent me.
Yeah,
That's
I
it.
would want to definitely film it for sure.
Michelle and I connected deeply, and we created the Nick Nocerino Crystal Skull Award at the first Crystal Conference. We gave it to Kirby Seed, who had worked. There's many students of Nick still around. Kirby Seed is another one, SEID. And again, I can give you all this information, send it to you. They are active. There are 3 that can be seen, and you guys should see them.
Okay.
There
Well,
isn't a shaman on the planet that shouldn't see an ancient crystal skull.
Well, Stephen, thank you so freaking much. I'm just so enamored and blessed to have heard all of this.
Once you connect this, I will send the pictures so people can see. And I have other pictures.
Okay.
A great priceless
send me the
picture
pictures.
of Nick Nocerino working with the amethyst skull.
Okay.
I'm so glad I took that picture.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you so much. And
Sweet.
have a wonderful holiday season, a wonderful
You all
Christmas,
too.
wonderful
Same to you.
holidays and New Year. And I will
And
be,
solstice.
our next show will be next
Happy
year.
solstice on the 21st.
Yes.
Okay, we can wait till next year if you'd like.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, yeah, because we're almost done with this month. So
Right, well, we have before New Year's if you want, but that's up to you.
okay, we could try to fit one in.
Whatever works for you, like I said.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Much love to you and your
Thank you.
lovely wife.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.